Welcome to the Dark Chronicle. Tell us in the comments which country you're watching from and the time of day it is for you. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell to catch every chilling tale. They were born before dawn, when the plantation slept and even the insects seemed to hold their breath. The cabin where their mother labored was little more than warped planks and mud-chinked seams, but that night it became the center of her entire world. Rain tapped softly on the roof as if afraid to intrude. When the first cry split the dark, she bit her lip to keep from screaming too loudly. Sound carried on a plantation, and joy was a dangerous thing to announce. The boy came first. He was small but fierce, his fists clenched tight as if already grasping at something invisible. She named him Elijah, a name she had kept hidden for years, passed down in whispers from her own mother. Minutes later came the girl, silent at first, eyes wide and alert, studying the world as if she already understood it would not be kind. When she finally cried, it was sharp and brief. Mara. The name felt like strength on the tongue. The midwife wrapped them quickly and pressed them into their mother's arms. For a moment the world narrowed to warmth and heartbeat and breath. In that fragile circle she leaned close and whispered the only inheritance she could give them. "You belong to yourselves," she said softly. "No matter what they say, remember that." Elijah slept. Mara stared. On the plantation, children learned early that love was a liability. Families were tools, assembled and dismantled at will. Brothers were sold away from sisters, mothers from sons, all justified with ledgers and signatures. That Elijah and Mara were allowed to remain together was not mercy, it was convenience. They were small, weak, and worth more together than apart. For now, their earliest memories were of dirt and heat and the rhythm of labor. Elijah learned to walk between rows of cotton, his small feet toughened by soil and stone. Mara learned to listen. She noticed patterns when the overseer's shadow stretched longest, when the dogs were fed, when the White House lights went dark. While other children cried or played, she watched. Their mother taught them without seeming to. She showed Elijah how to keep his face still when struck, how anger could be swallowed and saved like a blade hidden under cloth. She taught Mara how to count without numbers, heartbeats, steps, breaths. At night, when the cabin was quiet, she told them stories of places where chains were melted into tools and names could not be taken. She never said the word freedom loudly. She treated it like a prayer. As they grew, difference sharpened between them. Elijah became careful, measured, his strength tucked away behind obedience. He learned how to disappear in plain sight, how to make himself useful without being noticed. Mara grew sharp-edged. She asked questions she shouldn't, not aloud but with her eyes. Overseers disliked the way she looked at them, as if weighing them. The first time Elijah was whipped, he was 8. He had dropped a basket while exhausted from the heat. The pain was blinding, but worse was the sound, Mara's breath catching as she watched from the line. Elijah didn't cry out. He focused on her face instead, on the silent promise forming between them. Endure. Remember. That night, their mother cleaned his wounds with shaking hands. She said nothing until the lantern burned low. Then she spoke, voice thin but steady. "They will try to make you believe this is all there is," she said, "but it is not. Your lives are bigger than this place." She looked at Mara. "Your mind is your weapon." She looked at Elijah. "Your patience is your shield." The plantation shifted owners when Elijah was 10. With new ownership came new rules, harsh accounts, colder eyes. Rumors spread like smoke, sales coming, debts unpaid. One afternoon, a wagon arrived without warning. Names were called. Their mother's name was one of them. Mara understood before Elijah did. She saw the way their mother's shoulders stiffened, the way her hands pressed briefly to each child's head, as if memorizing them. Elijah ran forward when the overseer grabbed her arm. He was thrown back hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs. Their mother did not scream. She only turned once, eyes fierce, and mouthed words they would carry forever. "Live." The wagon rolled away. Dust swallowed it. That was the day childhood ended. The nights after were hollow. Mara stopped sleeping. Elijah stopped speaking much. They were kept together, but the space their mother had filled became a constant ache. Around them, the plantation continued its brutal rhythm, indifferent to loss. That indifference carved something cold and solid inside them both. Elijah began to listen more closely. He memorized patrol routes, learned which guards drank too much, which dogs were lazy, which paths were avoided because of snakes or mud. He did it quietly, filing details away. Mara began to plan. Not escape, not yet, but survival with purpose. She stole moments to study the sky, the way moss grew on trees, the sound of the river beyond the far fields. They spoke little, but when they did, it mattered. Short exchanges at night, faces close in the dark. They took her because she mattered, Mara said once. They take people because they can, Elijah replied. Mara shook her head. No, because she was strong, because she made us strong. The idea settled between them, heavy and dangerous. Strength invited punishment, but it also invited hope. By the time Elijah was 12 and Mara 10, they were no longer just surviving. They were preparing, though neither would have named it that. Elijah trained his body through labor, conserving energy, learning when to push and when to bend. Mara trained her mind, mapping the world beyond the plantation from scraps of overheard talk, from the direction of trains, from the smell of river water after rain. Other enslaved people noticed. Some warned them to be careful, others looked at them with something like fear. Dreams were contagious, and overseers sensed it. They watched the siblings more closely now. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Elijah and Mara stood at the edge of the fields. Beyond them lay trees, dense and dark, whispering of unknown paths. Elijah felt the familiar pull of patience. Wait, endure, survive. Mara felt something sharper. Now is not yet, but it will come. They did not know how or when. They only knew one truth, forged in loss and silence: they would not be separated again. Whatever waited beyond those trees, dogs, guns, men, death, they would face it together. And somewhere, carried on the wind through rows of cotton and memory, their mother's voice still followed them, steady and unbroken. Live. The decision did not arrive like lightning. It settled slowly, the way night crept across the fields, quiet, inevitable, impossible to stop once it began. After their mother was taken, time on the plantation lost its shape. Days blurred into one another, marked only by pain, sweat, and the long silences Elijah and Mara shared. Yet beneath that stillness something was forming, hard and deliberate. They waited because waiting was survival. Elijah understood this in his bones. Every impulse to run had to be strangled before it showed on his face. He watched men who tried too early, caught within hours, dragged back bleeding, turned into lessons for everyone else. Patience kept you alive. Patience bought you time. And time, he believed, could be shaped. Mara hated the waiting, but she learned to respect it. While Elijah studied people, she studied space. She noticed how the land changed with seasons, how the swamp swelled in spring and shrank by late summer, how fog clung low to the ground after certain rains. She learned the language of birds and insects, which sounds meant danger, and which meant the forest was at ease. The plantation tried to crush curiosity, but curiosity slipped through cracks like water. At night, they spoke in fragments, careful not to wake others. Their words were soft, shaped by necessity. "The dogs," Mara whispered once, "they always run them after sunrise." Elijah nodded in the dark. "They change guards at midnight. Not on Sundays, not when it rains." They were not planning an escape yet. They were building a map inside their heads, one detail at a time. Each observation was a brick. Each remembered pattern a hidden door. The overseers grew harsher as rumors of debt and unrest spread. More patrols, more counting, more fear. Elijah felt the pressure building, like a fist tightening around the plantation. Pressure made men sloppy. It also made them cruel. That balance mattered. The first real test came when a boy from another cabin tried to run alone. He made it less than a mile. The dogs brought him back before noon. The punishment lasted longer than anyone could remember. Elijah forced himself to watch. Mara turned her face away, but she listened. She listened to the rhythm of boots, to the way the men laughed when they thought fear had done its job. That night, Mara's hands shook with rage. "They do this so we never try," she said. Elijah's voice was steady, though his chest burned. "They do it so we try the wrong way." After that, they began to move more deliberately. Elijah volunteered for tasks that took him near the stables, the storage sheds, the edge of the fields. He learned the smell of iron and leather, the sound of different horses' hooves. He noticed which animals spooked easily, and which stood calm even when men shouted. Calm horses were valuable. Calm horses were guarded less closely. Mara found reasons to be near the kitchen, the laundry, the trash pits where scraps were thrown away. She listened to white men talk when they thought no one paid attention. She learned names of nearby towns, rivers, crossings. She learned which directions people were taken when sold south, and which direction people whispered about when they spoke of the north. That word, north, hovered like a ghost. No one could point to it exactly, but everyone knew it meant away. They stole carefully, never enough to be noticed. A scrap of cloth here, a bent nail there, a compass, small and dented, slipped from a drunk guard's coat one night and hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Mara held it like a relic. She didn't know how to use it yet, but she would. Seasons turned. Elijah grew taller, his shoulders broadening under labor. Mara's gaze sharpened, her movements precise. They were watched more now, but not closely enough. The overseers saw obedience where there was calculation. That mistake would cost them. The night the fields went silent, it began with fog. Fog was rare enough to unsettle men who relied on sight and sound. It rolled in low and thick, swallowing the ground up to the knees, then the waist. Lantern light bent and blurred. Elijah felt his pulse slow as the world softened around them. Fog hid footprints, fog confused dogs, fog made distance meaningless. They did not speak when the signal came, a subtle shift in posture, a shared breath. This was not impulse, this was the result of years of restraint. Mara moved first, slipping away toward the stables as if pulled by shadow. Elijah followed a different path, casual, unhurried, carrying tools like any other night worker. His hands were steady as he loosened a stable gate, just enough to look faulty, not sabotaged. He adjusted horseshoes with practiced care, turning them slightly so tracks would lie. It was a small thing, but small things mattered. Mara worked fast. She took nothing that would weigh them down. Food could be found or stolen later. Shoes would only slow them. She wrapped the compass in cloth and tucked it against her skin. When she returned, her eyes were bright, sharp with focus. They met at the edge of the fields, where cotton gave way to wild grass. For one breathless moment, Elijah looked back. The cabins crouched in the fog like exhausted animals. Somewhere in one of them, a space still remembered their mother's voice. He did not let himself linger. They ran, not straight, never straight. They cut sideways first, then doubled back, then veered again, letting the fog erase their shape. Elijah counted steps, listening for the rhythm of patrol boots. Mara watched the ground, choosing paths where grass grew thin and roots broke up footprints. When they reached the river, they did not hesitate. They plunged in, cold stealing their breath, water closing over their waists, their chests. Elijah forced himself to slow, to move against the current just enough to confuse scent. They stayed in the river until their legs burned. When they emerged, they did not rest. Rest was a luxury they could not afford yet. By dawn, the plantation discovered the absence. Bells rang, voices rose, dogs were loosed. The chase began with confidence and noise, men shouting orders, convinced of easy capture. Elijah and Mara were already miles away, their bodies aching, their minds clear. They moved as they had planned, by memory, by instinct, by trust. When Elijah slowed, Mara urged him forward. When Mara stumbled, Elijah steadied her without a word. Hunger gnawed early, but fear sharpened them. Fear reminded them what waited behind. By noon, riders spread across the land like a net. By evening, bounty posters were being imagined, numbers discussed with greedy smiles. Men who had never met Elijah or Mara decided they already owned them. The siblings did not know how many would come. They only knew the forest ahead was vast, unforgiving, and alive. Every step carried risk. Every breath was borrowed. As night fell again, colder this time, Elijah and Mara pressed into the darkness beneath the trees. The fog thinned, replaced by stars that looked indifferent and endless. Mara touched the compass, finally daring to glance at it. The needle trembled, then steadied. Elijah followed her gaze northward. He did not smile. There was nothing to celebrate yet. Survival was still a question mark. Behind them, horns sounded and dogs howled. Ahead of them lay swamp, river, forest, and men who would kill for a reward. Elijah squeezed Mara's hand once, briefly grounding them both. The waiting was over. The hunt had begun. By the third sunrise after they fled, the land itself seemed to know they were being hunted. Birds lifted too suddenly. Deer froze longer than they should have. Even the wind carried sound farther, as if betraying them. Elijah felt it in his chest before he heard it. The distant thunder of hooves, the uneven chorus of dogs. The chase had grown teeth. They had expected pursuit. What they had not expected was scale. Men poured in from every direction, drawn by rumor and money. Planters sent riders eager to prove loyalty. Former soldiers came with old rifles and newer grudges. Professional trackers arrived with lean faces and quiet confidence, men who spoke little and read the ground like scripture. By the time the sun climbed high, the forest behind them crawled with movement. The bounty had spread like fire. 100 men, some said. Maybe more. Numbers mattered less than intent, and intent was everywhere. Elijah slowed them deliberately. Panic wasted strength. He chose paths that forced the hunters to make decisions, forks where scent split, ground where tracks overlapped, stretches where the forest thickened and swallowed sound. He remembered his mother's words about patience, about letting others reveal themselves. Men chasing in anger made mistakes. Mara stayed ahead, eyes scanning constantly. She watched for broken twigs that were too clean, for disturbed moss, for birds that refused to settle. She learned the hunters' habits quickly. Some rode hard, trusting speed. Others moved cautiously, stopping often, reading signs. The dangerous ones were quiet. Those men worried her. They crossed rocky ground where hooves slipped and cursed riders slowed. They doubled back through bramble, letting thorns tear their skin while horses balked. When the dogs grew closer, Elijah led them into water again, this time a shallow creek littered with stones. He moved upstream, then suddenly downstream, then out again onto hard-packed earth where scent would fade. Still the dogs kept coming. By the fourth day, hunger hollowed them out. They chewed roots and bitter leaves Mara recognized from half-remembered lessons. Elijah trapped a rabbit with a loop of stolen wire, snapping its neck quickly, silently. They ate without fire, hands shaking, teeth aching. There was no room for disgust. Survival stripped life down to essentials. That night, rain fell hard and cold. It was a blessing and a curse. It masked sound, blurred tracks, confused scent. It also soaked them through, dragged heat from their bones, slowed their steps. They pressed on anyway, teeth chattering, muscles screaming. Elijah could feel exhaustion creeping in, the kind that dulled judgment. He fought it with counted steps, breaths, heartbeats, anything to keep his mind sharp. The hunters began to fracture. Greed pulled them apart. Some argued over direction, convinced the siblings had turned east or south. Others swore they had seen shapes moving through fog that morning and chased ghosts for hours. One group fired wildly into the trees at a sound that turned out to be nothing more than a startled boar. The forest punished noise. It closed ranks around the quiet. Elijah noticed the change first. The sounds behind them grew uneven, scattered. Instead of one solid roar, there were bursts, shouts here, gunshots there, then long stretches of nothing. The net was tearing. Mara exploited it. She tore a strip from her dress and tied it to a low branch near a steep ravine, then carefully erased their real path with her hands and feet. She snapped branches leading toward the drop, scuffed the earth, pressed false footprints deep. Hunters would see what they wanted to see. Hope made men careless. Hours later they heard shouting echo sharply, then stop. They did not celebrate. Near sunset they encountered the quiet ones. 3 men stood ahead on the path, rifles lowered but ready, eyes scanning calmly. No shouting, no dogs, just stillness. Elijah's chest tightened. These men knew how to wait. He pulled Mara sideways without a word, easing them into thicker brush. They moved slowly, inch by inch, letting leaves brush their skin without shaking branches. One of the men shifted, head tilting slightly. Elijah froze. He focused on his breathing, making it shallow slowly. A minute passed, then another. Finally, the men moved on, convinced enough. Elijah did not release his breath until their footsteps faded. Mara's eyes met his, fierce and steady. She nodded once. They moved again. By the 5th day, legend began to grow among the hunters. Whispers passed from camp to camp of children who vanished into air, of tracks that led nowhere, of dogs that lost their nerve. Some men laughed it off. Others grew uneasy. Fear crept in alongside greed, souring it. The forest took its toll on the hunters as much as on the hunted. Horses went lame. Men argued, turned on each other. One tracker accused another of lying about signs. Fists flew, blood was spilled. Elijah watched from the ridge as 2 men nearly came to blows over a broken twig. He felt no triumph, only resolve. Division was a tool. Use it. Mara began to limp. It started as a slight favoring of one foot, then worsened. A jagged stone had split her skin days earlier, and Despite her attempts to ignore it, infection crept in. Elijah noticed the way her breath shortened, the way her pace slowed. He said nothing at first, letting her lead until she could not. When she stumbled, he caught her. "I can walk," she whispered fiercely. "I know," he said, "but I can carry you." They did not argue. Time was too precious. Elijah hoisted her onto his back and kept moving. His legs trembled under the added weight, but he locked his jaw and focused. Each step was a choice. Each step was refusal. The dogs found them again near dawn. Their baying cut through the trees, closer than before, frantic with renewed scent. Elijah altered course toward low ground where mist clung thickest. He waded into marshy earth, water seeping into his boots, mud sucking at his legs. He nearly fell twice but kept his balance, Mara's arms locked around his shoulders. They reached a stand of hollow trees just as the dogs burst into view. Elijah shoved Mara into one, then climbed into another, pulling rotten wood over the opening. The smell was overwhelming, decay, damp, old death. They pressed themselves still as dogs circled, barking, noses pressed close. A hunter dismounted nearby. Elijah could hear him breathing, could smell tobacco on his clothes. A dog scratched at the tree, whining. Elijah did not move. Mara did not blink. Minutes stretched into something unbearable. Then, slowly, the dogs were pulled away, confused by the swamp, by water, by old rot. The hunter cursed and followed. They waited long after silence returned. When they finally emerged, daylight was strong and unforgiving. Elijah's muscles screamed in protest. Mara's face was pale but determined. She touched his arm once, gratitude and apology tangled together. By then, some hunters had given up. They turned back, muttering about curses and bad luck. Others pushed on, driven by pride more than money. But the numbers were thinning. The forest was winning. Elijah and Mara crossed into colder ground that evening, signs of a different land ahead. Pines replaced broadleaf trees. The air sharpened. Somewhere beyond, borders blurred and laws changed. They did not know how many men still followed. They only knew that each mile behind them carried confusion, frustration, and doubt. Two shadows had drawn 100 men into a maze of mud, water, and fear. And the maze was far from finished. Cold arrived without warning, slipping in like a knife between ribs. One night the air had merely been sharp. The next, it bit hard enough to make breathing hurt. Elijah noticed it first in Mara's shivering, the way her teeth clicked even when she tried to still them. The forest had changed again. Pines stood closer together, their needles carpeting the ground and swallowing sound. Snow threatened but did not fall, leaving the world damp, grey, and merciless. They had been running for days, measured not by sunrise and sunset, but by exhaustion. Sleep came in fragments, minutes stolen behind fallen logs, under tangled roots, inside the narrow mercy of hollow trunks. Each time Elijah closed his eyes, he saw shapes moving toward them. Each time Mara drifted off, she woke with a start, hand flying to the compass at her chest as if it might vanish. The hunters who remained were different now. Fewer, yes, but sharper. They had shed the reckless and the greedy, leaving behind men who chased not for money alone but for pride. These men did not shout. They did not fire blindly. They followed at a distance, pressing slowly, patiently, letting hunger and cold do the work. Mara's foot worsened. The cut had swollen, angry and red, streaked with heat that frightened Elijah more than the sound of dogs. She tried to hide it, favoring the leg only when she thought he wasn't watching. But Elijah had learned her too well. Every uneven step tightened something in his chest. "We need to stop," he said finally, voice low. "We stop, they catch us," she replied, just as quietly. "We stop to treat it," he said, "or you won't walk at all." Mara looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were bright, fevered, but steady. Then she nodded once. Trust again, always. They found shelter in a shallow cave hidden behind a curtain of hanging roots. It was barely more than a wound in the earth, but it blocked wind and sight. Elijah cleaned the cut with freezing water. Teeth clenched as Mara sucked in breath to keep from crying out. He wrapped it with cloth torn from his shirt, tight but careful. Night pressed in heavy and dark. The cold deepened. Elijah pulled Mara close, wrapping his arms around her, sharing warmth as best he could. He stayed awake, listening. Somewhere in the distance, dogs barked, then fell silent. Somewhere closer, an owl cried. Hunger gnawed at them both, a dull ache that sapped strength and sharpened thoughts. Elijah remembered stories of men who starved within sight of freedom. He pushed the thought away. Fear was a luxury. He could not afford it. They moved again before dawn, slower now. Elijah took on more weight, carrying what little they had, steadying Mara when the ground dipped or rose too sharply. The forest seemed to close in, branches reaching, roots grasping at their feet. The sky stayed low and gray, pressing down. At one point they heard voices ahead. Elijah dropped instantly, pulling Mara down with him. They pressed into the earth, breath held. 2 hunters passed not 10 paces away, rifles slung, talking quietly. "She can't last much longer," one said. "They'll slow." "Don't rush it," the other replied. "They make mistakes when they're tired." The words crawled under Elijah's skin. He waited until the voices faded before moving again, rage and fear mixing into something dangerously close to despair. By afternoon, snow began to fall, not enough to blanket the ground, just enough to blur edges and steal heat. It coated Mara's hair, melted against her skin. Elijah felt his own fingers grow numb, clumsy. He flexed them constantly, terrified of losing feeling. They reached a river as the light began to fail. It was wider than the others, fast-moving, edged with ice. Crossing it would erase scent again, buy time. It would also be deadly. Mara looked at the water, then at Elijah. "If we don't cross," she said, "they catch us tonight." Elijah nodded. He did not trust his voice. He lifted her onto his back and stepped in. The cold slammed into him like a blow. His legs went numb instantly. Muscles screaming. The current pulled hard, threatening to take them both. He angled upstream, inch by inch, focusing on each step, each breath. Halfway across, his foot slipped on a hidden stone and he nearly went under. Mara tightened her grip, a small sound escaping her throat. "I've got you," Elijah muttered, though he wasn't sure who he was convincing. They made it across and collapsed on the far bank, bodies shaking uncontrollably. Elijah forced himself up, dragging them both into the trees. Stopping too long meant death by cold. He rubbed Mara's arms, stamped his feet, moved until sensation crept back in like pain. Behind them, dogs howled in frustration at the river's edge. They did not light a fire. Smoke would betray them. Instead, they buried themselves beneath a fallen tree, layering pine needles and leaves over their bodies, sealing in what little warmth they could. Elijah stayed awake, counting Mara's breaths, afraid to let sleep steal her away. At some point in the night, footsteps approached. Close, too close. A hunter moved through the trees, lantern held low, its light swinging gently. Elijah felt Mara tense beside him. He pressed a hand to her arm, stilling her. The hunter paused, sniffed the air, frowned. He stood there long enough for Elijah's muscles to start trembling from the effort of stillness. Then the man moved on. Elijah did not breathe again until the sound was gone. Morning brought no relief. Mara's fever spiked, her skin hot against the cold air. She stumbled more often now, her pride fighting her body. Elijah took her weight again without comment, though each step felt like fire in his legs. "Why won't you leave me?" she whispered at one point, delirious with pain. "You'd be faster." Elijah stopped. He turned so she could see his face clearly. "Because then they win," he said, "and because you are not leaving me, ever." Something in his voice cut through the fog in her mind. She nodded, tears freezing on her lashes. The hunters pressed closer that day. Elijah could feel it. The forest grew louder with pursuit. Branches snapping, distant shouts, the occasional crack of a rifle fired more in frustration than aim. He altered course again, leading them toward old ground scarred by mining long ago. He remembered overhearing guards talk about it, about tunnels and collapses. By dusk they reached it. The earth was pocked with openings, half hidden by brush, the remains of abandoned shafts. The air smelled of rust and damp stone. Elijah guided Mara toward the largest opening, heart pounding. It was a gamble. Inside could be shelter, or a trap. They slipped into the darkness just as voices rose behind them. Inside, the tunnel narrowed quickly, forcing them to crouch. The ceiling groaned softly, shedding dust. Elijah moved carefully, every step deliberate. He felt the ground vibrate faintly as men approached the entrance. He guided Mara into a side passage, barely visible, and pressed her against the wall. He loosened rocks near the entrance, stacking them precariously. Then he waited. Hunters entered, lanterns bobbing, voices echoing. One laughed nervously, another cursed the smell. As they moved deeper, Elijah shoved hard. The rocks fell. The sound was thunderous, echoing through the shaft. Dust filled the air. Shouts turned to screams. The entrance collapsed in on itself, sealing the tunnel behind them. Elijah grabbed Mara and moved deeper until the air cleared and silence returned. They did not know how many men were trapped. They did not stop to listen. When they emerged hours later through a smaller opening far down the slope, the world was quiet. Snow fell steadily now, softening everything it touched. Elijah helped Mara down the incline, every muscle screaming, every nerve raw. They did not look back. Somewhere behind them, hunters would argue, curse, invent stories. Some would say the siblings died in the collapse. Others would swear the forest itself had turned against them. Elijah only knew one thing. As he led Mara onward into the white dim trees, the hunt was breaking, and they were still moving. Silence followed them like a fragile gift. After the mine, after the collapse and the screams swallowed by stone, the forest grew unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath. Snow softened every sound, laying a pale hand over branches and footprints alike. Elijah moved cautiously, half expecting pursuit to explode again at any moment, but hours passed with nothing but wind and the distant creak of trees shifting under cold. Mara slept as he walked, her weight heavy but familiar against his back. Fever still burned in her, though it ebbed and surged rather than raging unchecked. Elijah adjusted his pace to match her breathing, afraid that stopping too long would steal heat from her body. Every so often he whispered her name, not to wake her, but to anchor her. She answered, sometimes with a murmur, sometimes with nothing at all. By morning they reached higher ground. The land sloped upward, rocky and uneven, dotted with scrub and stubborn trees that clung to life despite the cold. Elijah welcomed the elevation. Fewer rivers meant fewer crossings, fewer chances for scent to be picked up again. The hunters would struggle here, horses especially. He could almost feel the net unraveling behind them. They found shelter in the ruins of an old cabin perched near a ridge, its roof collapsed, its walls half standing like broken teeth. Inside, the air was still, dry enough to rest without freezing. Elijah laid Mara down gently and inspected her wound again. The swelling had not worsened. That alone felt like mercy. He gathered what he could, dry wood, moss, scraps of cloth, and dared a small fire hidden deep within the ruin, its smoke trapped by stone and snow. The heat was weak but real. Mara stirred, eyes fluttering open. "Did we die?" she whispered, voice rough. Elijah smiled despite everything. Not yet. She tried to sit up, winced, then laughed softly, a sound so unexpected it startled him. "They'll tell stories," she said, "about the mine." "They already are," Elijah replied. "Let them." They shared what little food they had left. Hunger still clawed, but it was quieter now, less frantic. Elijah allowed himself a moment to sit, to feel the ache in his legs, the stiffness in his hands. He'd been running on something beyond strength for days. Now that the danger felt only slightly farther away, exhaustion threatened to claim him. He did not let it. Instead, he listened. Far below, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of shouting, not close, not organized. Voices overlapped, angry, confused. The hunt was no longer a single force. It had fractured completely. By afternoon, movement appeared on the ridge opposite theirs. 3 men, then 2 more, trudging through snow, arguing openly. No dogs, no horses, just stubbornness and pride dragging them onward. Elijah watched from cover, memorizing their path. When they disappeared downslope, he waited another hour before moving again. They traveled at dusk, keeping low, skirting ridgelines instead of crossing them. The cold deepened, but the sky cleared, stars sharp and bright overhead. Somewhere beyond this land lay places where bounty posters meant nothing, where laws shifted and men could vanish into crowds instead of forests. Mara walked more now, leaning on him but insisting on her own steps. "I need to remember how," she said when Elijah offered to carry her again. He did not argue. They reached the borderlands on the 7th day after the mine. Elijah knew it not from signs or markers, but from the way the land changed again. Roads appeared, old, rutted, rarely used but real. Fences, broken and mended 100 times. Smoke on the horizon that did not smell like plantation fires. This was the most dangerous place of all. Freedom's edge was thick with traps. Men here hunted not out of duty but opportunity. They watched roads and crossings, waiting for desperate figures to reveal themselves. Elijah avoided paths, moving parallel to them, using the woods as cover. Every instinct screamed caution. That night they encountered their final snare. It began with fire. A line of flame crept through the trees ahead, controlled but relentless, driven by men who understood how to shape the forest into a funnel. Smoke drifted low, stinging eyes, forcing movement. Elijah cursed under his breath. This was not panic or pride. This was strategy. Mara saw it too. "They're closing us in," she said. "Yes," Elijah replied, "which means they think we're predictable." He turned them toward a narrow ravine where snow lay deeper and the ground dropped sharply. Hunters would expect them to avoid it. Injured, exhausted, they would assume the siblings would choose easier ground. Elijah chose risk. They descended carefully, sliding more than walking, grabbing roots and rocks to slow themselves. At the bottom, a dark opening yawned, a ventilation shaft, half buried, leading into the same web of abandoned tunnels that had saved them before. Elijah felt a cold thrill of recognition. The land remembered them, even if the men did not. They entered just as smoke thickened behind them. Inside, the air was cold but clear. Elijah moved with new confidence now, memory guiding him. He knew where tunnels collapsed, where air still flowed, where the ground was stable enough to trust. He led Mara through winding passages until the sounds of pursuit faded again. Then, deliberately, he doubled back alone. Mara protested weakly, grabbing his arm. "Don't." "I will," he said gently, "and I'll come back." He returned to the main shaft and scattered signs, footprints, dropped cloth, disturbed dust, leading toward a dead end. Then he loosened stones again, carefully, precisely. When voices echoed closer, he retreated through a narrow crawl space and waited. The collapse came louder than before. Dust roared. Men shouted in fury and fear. When silence returned, Elijah slipped away, heart pounding, and rejoined Mara at the far exit. They emerged miles from where they had entered, the night cold and clean around them. No voices followed. By morning there was nothing behind them but rumor. They moved openly now, not boldly, but without the same fear. Elijah cut their hair with a stolen knife, changing their silhouettes. Mara wrapped her foot tightly, fashioning a crude boot from cloth and bark. They practiced new names as they walked, testing how they felt in their mouths. At a crossroads, they overheard travelers talking. "You hear about those two," a man said. "100 hunters and they vanished. Some say they drowned. Others say the forest took them." Elijah and Mara exchanged a glance. Neither smiled. They passed through a small town at dusk, heads down, moving with the rhythm of people who belonged. No one stopped them. No one looked twice. The absence of chains felt unreal, like waking from a long, brutal dream. That night, they slept in a barn loft, hay soft beneath them, the smell of animals comforting. For the first time since the escape began, Elijah slept deeply. No counting, no listening, just darkness and rest. When he woke, sunlight spilled through the cracks in the boards. Mara was awake, watching dust float in the air. "We're still here," she said. Elijah nodded. "They're not." Beyond the barn lay roads leading north, places where the past loosened its grip with every mile. The hunt had ended not with a capture or a corpse, but with confusion and silence. 100 men had tried to take them, and failed. They rose together, gathered their few things, and stepped back into the world, not as fugitives, but as something new, something unfinished, carrying scars and names that had not yet fully formed. Ahead waited the last stretch. Freedom was no longer a question of survival, it was a matter of arrival. Morning came softly, without alarms or shouting or the snap of whips. Sunlight filtered through the barn boards in thin, patient lines, warming the hay and the air around them. Elijah woke first, instinctively holding still, listening for danger. For a moment, his body did not believe the quiet. Then he heard Mara breathing steadily beside him, slow and even, and something inside him loosened. They did not rush to leave. That, more than anything, told Elijah the hunt was over. When you were hunted, every second screamed at you to move. Now the seconds simply passed. They stepped out after dawn, blending into the small stream of people moving along the road. Farmers, traders, families, faces marked by work rather than fear. Elijah kept his head lower, but he noticed how no one stared too long, how no one counted him. Mara walked carefully, her foot still stiff, but she walked on her own. At the edge of town stood a notice board layered with old papers. Elijah stopped without meaning to. There were posters there, faded, curling at the edges, drawings of faces that barely resembled the people they hunted. names written boldly, confidently, as if ink itself could capture a human being. Mara followed his gaze. She did not step closer. "They don't know us," she said quietly. "No," Elijah agreed. "They never did." They moved on. As the days passed, the land softened. Roads widened, accents changed, the deeper south faded into memory with each mile northward. Elijah felt it in the air, in the way people spoke more freely, in how their eyes slid past him instead of through him. Danger still existed, it always would, but it no longer stalked them with dogs and guns and fire. Mara healed slowly. Each night, Elijah cleaned her wound, careful and gentle. Each morning, she walked a little farther, leaned on him a little less. Strength returned not all at once, but steadily, like light lengthening after winter. They learned to live among people again. In one town, a woman gave them bread without asking questions. In another, a man offered work unloading carts in exchange for coin and silence. Elijah took it, muscles remembering labor without the lash. Mara sat nearby, watching, listening, learning how free people spoke to one another. At night, they practiced their new names softly, testing them the way one tests a shoe before committing to a long walk. Some names felt too heavy, others slid off. They laughed once, quietly, when Elijah forgot his own and answered to the wrong one. The sound startled them both. Laughter felt dangerous at first, like tempting fate. Weeks passed, winter loosened its grip. Snow receded into mud, then into memory. The story of the hunt spread faster than they did, twisting and growing with every telling. Elijah heard fragments in taverns and at crossroads. "They say the siblings drowned. No, shot near the border. I heard the forest swallowed them whole." Each version ended the same way, no bodies, no bounty, no proof. Elijah and Mara listened without comment. Their survival felt like a secret they carried together, fragile and powerful. Eventually they reached a town that felt different, larger, louder, filled with movement and noise that made it impossible to track any one person for long. Here they were not unusual. Here they were simply two more faces in a crowd. They stayed. Elijah found work with wood. His hands, once used only for survival, learned to shape and build. He liked the honesty of it, how effort turned into something solid, something that lasted. People paid him fairly. Some nodded to him in the street. Mara learned letters. At first she watched children walking into a small schoolhouse, books clutched to their chests. She watched them for days before daring to ask questions. The teacher, an older woman with sharp eyes and a softer voice, listened without judgment. She gave Mara paper and charcoal and time. Mara devoured knowledge the way starving people devour food. Letters became words, words became power. Soon she helped other children with their lessons, explaining patiently, fiercely, the way she had once planned escape routes in her mind. At night, the siblings talked, not about the chase, not much. They spoke of the future, cautiously at first, then more boldly. Elijah talked about owning his own tool someday. Mara talked about teaching others who had never been allowed to learn. They spoke of their mother often now, without pain sharp enough to steal breath. "She'd like this," Mara said once, watching snow fall outside their small rented room. Elijah nodded. "She knew we'd get here." Sometimes the past reached for them in dreams. Elijah woke sweating, hearing dogs that were not there. Mara dreamed of fire in the forest, of tunnels collapsing. They learned to wake each other gently, to anchor one another in the present. They were not untouched by what they had survived. They were shaped by it. Years passed. The world shifted. Laws changed unevenly, imperfectly, but enough that the old plantation life began to crack. New people arrived in town, carrying stories similar to theirs. Escapes, losses, long roads north. Mara listened to them, helped them learn letters, helped them learn how to live without asking permission. Elijah watched over her quietly, the way he always had. One afternoon, a man came into the workshop where Elijah worked. He spoke casually, but his eyes lingered too long. He asked questions that brushed too close to the past. Elijah answered carefully, politely. When the man left, Elijah did not panic. That night, he told Mara, they packed only what mattered. They left before dawn. Not running, choosing, they settled again, farther north, farther from the stories. Freedom, Elijah learned, was not a place you reached once. It was something you kept choosing, over and over, with awareness and courage. In their new town, they became known for what they did, not what they had been. Elijah's work stood strong in homes and shops. Mara's students grew confident, curious, unafraid to ask questions. Years later, a child asked Mara why she never spoke of where she came from. Mara smiled gently, "Because I'm more interested in where we're going." On certain nights, when the wind moved through the trees just right, Elijah and Mara sat together in silence. They listened, not for pursuit, but for memory. The forest no longer sounded like danger, it sounded like distance. They had been hunted by 100 men. Not one had taken them. They had crossed rivers, fire, stone, cold, and fear itself. They had learned that survival was not just endurance but loyalty, to each other, to the future they refused to surrender. They kept their old names between themselves, like a sacred thing. New names carried them through the world. Both were true, and when they looked back, it was not with terror or triumph, but with quiet certainty. They had not escaped only to live, they had escaped to